Welcome to the Not Your Average Public Servants podcast, a limited series podcast that reimagines what public service looks and feels like from Nigeria to the world. I'm your host, Oluchi Tamara, a public servant, a strategist, a cultural diplomat, and unapologetic believer in the power of public service done right. Each episode, we explore real stories from within the system and sometimes far outside of it. From honest conversations with public servants to bold ideas on governance, diplomacy, and development, this space is for people who believe that public service can be better, and already is in many unseen ways. So whether you're in government, you're working for change, or you're just curious, please pull up a seat. Let's talk. So when you hear about public servants or public service, particularly in Nigeria, or honestly almost anywhere, what comes to mind? Be honest. Is it slow service, faded files, handwritten invoices and receipts, shabby offices, nonchalant staff, mini gods, happy weekend, or I better know someone on the inside? Well, what if I said that that's not the full story, and that it's not just a Nigerian problem? So I've spent over a decade in and around public service and a little less in the private sector. I think I know what I'm saying. I've watched teams stretch under pressure to deliver excellence. I've seen colleagues pour themselves into service with little recognition and even less support. And yet, even when we deliver, we are met with skepticism. We've managed multi-billion naira partnerships. We've built tourism engagement strategies. We've reformed deviation processes. But still, the label public servant feels like a punchline. So despite the results we drive, the systems that we strengthen, and the reforms that we try to champion, I'm still told, oh, you people are government workers, you must be chilling. I remember speaking with a few HR friends in private sector, and I was hearing things like, you've worked too long in public service, you won't get it. You see? So this is not just about me. It's a statement about how we as a society perceive government workers. So let me say clearly, I am not lazy, I am not inefficient, and neither are so many of my colleagues. We are not your average public servants. Who is a public servant? What is public service really? It's a foundation of any function in society. It's a link between policy and people. It's a customs officer who waves you through, the street light that works, the hospital that are full to capacity, but you can still count on them. It's the person behind the desk when everything else is falling apart. These moments are not just the work of politicians, they are the work of people in service. So a quick story time. I was at a particular strategy session for a national project where I was consulting, and the room was split between private sector consultants and public sector staff. You could feel the divide, not just in titles, but in energy, in how ideas were received, in how voices were respected. It was heartbreaking because I could relate to the public staff. I could relate to their expertise, their dedication, and yet they were barely acknowledged in the room. And I remember thinking, why does this happen? Why is this still happening? Why do we assume that excellence can only come from the outside? It was one of those moments that reminded me why this podcast is necessary. Because unless we start telling a different story, nothing changes. So let's widen the lens a bit globally. When we look at the countries often described as developed, the ones we admire for structure, fairness, opportunity, what we are really seeing is the result of decades of coordinated public service. These things don't fall from the sky. They are systems run by people. They are managed by people and protected by people. And that's what public service can be. And when we talk about public service, we must recognize those 7 beyond borders as well. The people working at the United Nations, ECOWAS, the African Development Bank, ICAO, and countless other international organizations. They are public servants too. They are the ones shaping global policies on climate, development, peacekeeping, food systems, and humanitarian aid. They work in war zones, they coordinate refugee responses, they craft public health guidelines, they negotiate for the world's most vulnerable, often behind the scenes, and with very little recognition. But their work matters. So you see that the passports you carry, the flight regulations that keep you safe, the food aid that reaches disaster zones, the education programs in refugee camps, these are often made possible by global public servants. Whether you are a state level officer in Ogun State, a procurement specialist in Lagos, or humanitarian analyst in Geneva, you are part of the same lineage. You're not just doing a job. No, you're sustaining systems that hold humanity together. One of the biggest misconceptions about public service is that it's only about politics, that it's reserved for people with connections, that it's slow, it's outdated, it's irrelevant. But what people get wrong is that public service is not just about laws, it's about lives. It's not just about power, it's about people again. People assume that everyone in the government is corrupt, that every contract was padded, every worker is clocking in late and leaving early. And yes, there are real problems, there are bad eggs, there are outdated systems, but there's also a legal officer who reviews contracts for hours to prevent loss of public funds. There's a civil service secretary who keeps things running while ministers change like seasons. What people get wrong is that they focus so much on the failures that they miss the quiet wins. They forget that every functioning airport, every approved grant, every new road, every census, every voter registration exercise is managed, is filed, is followed up on, or executed by someone in public service. They forget sometimes that in the middle of chaos is about a public servant who ensures there's still order. And most of all, they forget that public servants are not separate from the people. They are the people. They are our parents, our siblings, our neighbors, working in a flawed system, also doing their best. This podcast exists to remind us of that. The government is not some mystical construct or an abstract concept. It's not a single entity with a master plan. The government is made up of people. When you say the government is failing, most times what is actually happening is that systems are breaking down. Because the people within them are under-resourced, they are demotivated, or they are unable to act with integrity. But when public servants are trained, when they are empowered and committed, they become the muscle of the country. The bridge between chaos and order, the memory, the real line between poverty and progress. Did you know that the OECD found that in many countries, trust in public service is more predictive of citizen satisfaction than even political leadership? And yet we often invest the least in them. Training, development, motivation. In Nigeria, public servants are often painted with one brush. But I've met people who stay up late to fix files, who serve despite not being paid, who show up because they believe this country deserves better. Without strong public service, nothing runs, no matter how good your president or your governor is. Period. Also, I say this gently, even if a nation stumbles in its choice of leadership, the stability of the country rests on its public servants. On the nurse who still shows up at the hospital every morning, even when her tools are limited and her name will never make the headlines. On the teacher who has not been paid in months but still stands before her class each day, determined to teach children how to be better than the world that they were born into. Or the procurement officer who refuses a bribe, knowing that no one may ever thank her for it, but corruption will not pass through her hands. Or the civil engineer who uses quality materials for public works, not because someone is watching, but because lives actually depend on it. On the police officer on patrol who chooses to protect rather than extort, who sees uniform as a duty, not a privilege. On the newly elected female boss who walks into the office every day having to prove again and again that her seat is earned, that her voice matters, that her leadership can be both firm and fair. On the young man who tries to build a career on merit but is still constantly overshadowed by whispers that his father's name opened all the doors, when in fact he has walked through many windows quietly on his own terms. These are the people who hold the country together. These are stories we rarely hear, but they are the ones that matter the most. Because systems don't save countries, people do. And public servants, when they are committed, equipped and valued, they become the soul of a functioning nation. That is why this podcast matters. Because if we don't tell the stories, people will continue to think that public servants don't care. And that is simply not true. We may not all wear capes, but many public servants are heroes in plain clothes, navigating tough times, navigating tough systems, serving people who may never know their names, and doing it for the love of country. So if you're listening to this and you've worked in service in any capacity, please know that I see you. If you've tried to push change in a bureaucratic maze, please know that I hear you. If you're someone who still believes that governance can be better, I'm building this for you. Because we have to change the narrative, one story at a time. If you are still wondering what this podcast will sound like, it will sound like real stories. Maybe a few shades thrown, a few sobs, but real stories. Stories from people who work behind the scenes in government, stories from people trying to get into government, stories from across Nigeria and beyond. And today I want to thank you for listening. Thank you for being curious, for showing up to see public service indifferently. Here's my question for you. Have you ever met a public servant who made a difference in your life or disappointed you? I want to hear both sides. So DM me at NYAPS podcast on socials or leave a message in the comment section. And stick around because next week we're busting myths. Public servants don't work. Government jobs are fallback plans. Civil service skills innovation. Government jobs are easy. They'll take bribes. You need connections to get in. We're putting all that on the table. My guest is Gen Z, and as you know, they are unfiltered and always have something to say. See you. Thank you for listening to the Not Your Average Public Servant podcast. If today's conversation sparked something new or made you see public service differently, please share it, leave a review, and subscribe wherever you listen. This show is part of a bigger mission to spotlight real people doing real work and to remind us all that government is not just a system. It is people, it is stories, and it's ours to shape. You can follow the podcast on socials at NYAPS Podcast. The podcast also streams on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and anywhere else that you get your podcasts. I am Oluchi Tamara. Until next time, keep showing up and never settle for average.